He boasted heaven bled upon his shaft. Then Al-Jabbaar unsealed a black sea of gnats that devoured his hosts and left him alone, a crown of buzzing buried in his skull. The sun did not merely shine upon the land of Shinar, it hammered against the earth like a judgment, baking the clay until the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of the heat. In the center of this sweltering furnace rose a monstrosity that defied the natural order, a structure so colossally arrogant that its shadow stretched for miles across the plains, swallowing villages in an artificial twilight. This was Babylon, the first great mistake of mankind, a city built not on the foundations of justice but on the broken spines of 1,000,000 faceless slaves. The air here did not smell of spices or river water, it reeked of bitumen, that thick black tar bubbling up from the underworld to bind the bricks, and the copper tang of fresh blood spilled by the whip. At the heart of this nightmare stood Nimrod, a man whose name would become a synonym for rebellion, though in his time he was worshipped as the hunter of souls and the first king to wear a crown of iron. He was not satisfied with the dominion of the horizontal world, with the conquest of beasts and the subjugation of his fellow men, for his appetite was a bottomless pit that could swallow oceans and still scream for more. While the scriptures might whisper of a tower built to reach the heavens, the reality was far more visceral and terrifying. It was an act of war. Nimrod walked the high ramparts of his unfinished ziggurat, his skin anointed with oils that glistened like liquid gold, his eyes fixed not on the suffering multitudes below who died by the hundred merely to hoist a single stone, but on the silent indifferent blue vault above. He believed with the feverish intensity of a madman that the Creator was merely another rival warlord, one who held the high ground only because no man had yet dared to build a ladder long enough to drag him down. The atmosphere in Babylon was thick with a tension that made the skin crawl, a collective holding of breath as the people waited for the lightning to strike, for the earth to open, for some sign that the heavens were watching this desecration. But there was only silence. The silence of the desert fed the arrogance of the king, convincing him that the throne of the universe was empty, waiting for a man with the will to seize it. He commanded his architects to build higher, to pierce the very belly of the clouds, and in his court sycophants whispered that the stars themselves were merely jewels waiting to be plucked for his crown. It is said that during the construction, if a brick fell and shattered, the overseers would weep for the loss of material, but if a man fell from the dizzying heights and burst upon the pavement, they would simply kick the ruin of his body into the mortar mix, binding the tower together with the literal flesh of the oppressed. This was the reign of the tyrant, a time when the concept of mercy had been erased from the human memory, replaced by the crushing weight of one man's ego. Nimrod stood at the precipice of the known world, looking up at the firmament with a sneer curling his lip, unaware that the attribute of the Almighty he was about to invoke was not the merciful or the provider, but Al-Jabbaar, the compeller, the one who repairs the broken by breaking the oppressor. The stage was set not for a battle of armies but for a humiliation so profound it would echo until the end of time. Yet on this morning the only sound was the rhythmic deafening thud of hammers and the delusional laughter of a king who thought he could murder God. The atmosphere atop the ziggurat was so thin and rarefied that a lesser man would have gasped for breath, but Nimrod inhaled the altitude as if it were the incense of his own divinity. He called for his weapon, not a tool of war forged for the ribs of men, but a monstrosity constructed of gopher wood and pounded iron, a bow so stiff and unyielding that 4 strong guards strained merely to bend it for stringing. This was an instrument of execution designed not for horizontal slaughter but for vertical assassination. The king stood alone on the highest platform, a golden speck against the blinding azure canvas of the sky, stripping the heavy robes of state from his shoulders to reveal a torso mapped with the scars of 1,000 conquests and muscles that coiled like pythons beneath oil-slicked skin. Below him the silence was absolute, a suffocating blanket of dread that smothered the millions of souls gathered at the base of the tower, for they understood that they were witnessing the ultimate transgression. They did not pray for their king to succeed, nor did they pray for him to fail, for the fear of the Almighty was warring in their hearts with the fear of the tyrant who stood before them, and in that moment the tyrant was closer and his cruelty was far more tangible. Nimrod selected a single arrow from a quiver made of human skin, a shaft of polished cedar tipped not with flint or bronze but with a diamond hard point sharpened to separate the soul from the spirit. He placed the notch against the gut of the bow and began to draw the string back, a feat of strength that caused the wood to groan like a dying ship and the veins in his neck to bulge until they threatened to burst. The air crackled with a static charge, a physical manifestation of the heresy being committed, as he aimed not at the horizon but directly at the zenith, the blinding center of the heavens where he imagined the throne of the Creator to sit. With a guttural roar that echoed off the brickwork like the bellow of a bull, he released the string. The sound was not a twang but a thunderclap, a sonic boom that slapped the air as the arrow vanished upward, swallowed instantly by the glare of the sun. Then came the waiting. It was a torture of time, a span of moments that stretched into eternities, where the only sound was the wind whistling through the unfinished arches of the tower and the rapid hammering of a million terrified hearts. The people squinted upward, shielding their eyes, waiting for a bolt of lightning to turn the tower into a pillar of ash, waiting for the ground to open and swallow the city whole, but the sky remained an impassive, unbroken blue. Minutes passed and the tension grew so brittle it threatened to snap the sanity of the onlookers, until a high, thin whistling sound pierced the quiet, growing louder and more shrill with every heartbeat. It was the sound of judgment returning to earth, but not in the form they expected. The arrow dropped from the heavens like a meteor, striking the pavement at Nimrod's feet with such force that it shattered the stone and embedded itself deep in the mortar. The king approached the vibrating shaft slowly, his chest heaving with exertion, and as he reached out to grasp it, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd below, for the shaft was wet. It was not merely damp with the moisture of the clouds, but dripping with a thick, viscous crimson fluid that pooled on the white stone. Nimrod pulled the arrow free and held it aloft, his hand stained with the fresh, bright arterial red of blood. A madness took him then, a delusion so profound and absolute that it eclipsed all reason. He threw his head back and laughed, a sound of jagged, rusted triumph, screaming to his people that he had done the impossible, that he had wounded the God of the heavens, that the Creator was mortal and bleeding, and that the throne was now vulnerable to his taking. He did not know that this blood was the ultimate deception, a final test of his arrogance, a bait laid by the compeller to seal his fate. It was a fish floating to the surface of a pond for the fish to catch the bird, a cosmic irony that the king in his vanity interpreted as victory. He smeared the blood across his face, a grotesque war paint of his own making, and the people below, seeing the red stain on their master's hands, fell to their faces in a wave of terror and coerced worship, believing that the heavens had indeed fallen. But the sky did not weep and the sun did not dim. The heavens were simply waiting, holding their breath with a terrifying patience, for the response of Al-Jabbaar is not always a sudden strike of lightning, but often a slow unraveling, a dismantling of the ego that begins with the illusion of success. Nimrod stood victorious on his tower, holding the bloody proof of his power, while miles away on the horizon the air began to darken, not with clouds but with the wings of the smallest, weakest soldiers in creation, gathering to answer the insult with a humiliation that would be remembered for 5,000 years. The dawn that followed the day of the bloody arrow was birthed in a silence so profound it felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop upon the neck of creation. Nimrod sat upon his throne of ivory and gold, a structure elevated high above his courtiers, his face still smeared with the dried crust of the blood he believed to be divine, a grotesque mask of victory that terrified his generals more than any defeat ever could. He had feasted while his people cowered, he had drunk wine from vessels stolen from the altars of conquered nations, and he had proclaimed that the age of the invisible God was over and the age of the visible man had begun. But as the sun began to climb toward its zenith, that same sun he claimed to have mastered, a disturbance rippled through the watchers on the high walls, not a cry of alarm but a murmur of confusion that spread like a contagion through the ranks of the elite guard. It began in the east, not from the heavens above but from the very edge of the horizon, where the flat dusty earth met the shimmering heat of the sky. At first it appeared to be a storm front, a bruise upon the blue skin of the day, a swelling darkness that hugged the ground and billowed upwards like smoke from a furnace that spanned the breadth of the world. The scouts blew their horns, the deep brassy notes rolling over the city, and Nimrod rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing not in fear but in anticipation, for he believed that the surviving forces of the heavens were coming to offer him battle on the ground. He had engaged the Creator in the air, and now he reasoned the Almighty was sending an army of angels or demons to contest his dominion over the earth. The king shouted his commands, and the city of Babylon transformed into a machine of war with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Gates of cedar and iron swung open, and out poured the legions of the tyrant, a river of steel and bronze that flowed onto the plain. There were chariots drawn by horses bred for violence, their manes braided with wire and their hooves shod with copper. There were infantrymen in ranks of 50,000 carrying spears so long they looked like a moving forest of spikes, and there were the giants, the Nephilim, offspring of old corruption, who stood heads and shoulders above the common men, wielding maces that could crush a boulder into sand. Nimrod rode at the head of this host clad in armor that was a masterpiece of the smith's art, plates of iron overlaid with gold engraved with curses against the Most High. He looked at the approaching darkness and smiled a wolfish grin, for he measured power by the weight of a sword and the thickness of a wall, and by those metrics he was invincible. But as the darkness drew nearer, swallowing the miles with unnatural speed, the behavior of the animals began to change. The warhorses, usually trained to ignore the screams of dying men and the roar of fire, began to stamp and whinny, their eyes rolling back in their heads, frothing at the mouth in a panic that no whip could subdue. The hunting dogs chained in the royal kennels howled in unison, a mournful, terrified sound that raised the hackles on the arms of the soldiers. The darkness on the horizon was not behaving like a storm, nor was it behaving like an army of men. It did not rumble with thunder, and it did not glitter with the reflection of spear points. It hummed. It was a sound that began at the very edge of hearing, a vibration that was felt in the teeth and the bones before it was heard with the ears, a low frequency thrumming like the plucking of a cosmic string that refused to stop vibrating. As the black wall advanced, blotting out the features of the landscape, turning the dunes and the scrub brush into featureless shadow, the sound grew in intensity, rising from a hum to a drone, and from a drone to a roar that rivaled the ocean in a gale. The light of the sun began to fail, not gradually as in a sunset, but rapidly, as if a heavy curtain was being drawn across the lamp of the world. The temperature plummeted, the baking heat of the desert replaced instantly by a clammy, suffocating chill that carried with it a scent not of ozone or rain but of musk and dust and the ancient stale air of a tomb. Nimrod raised his sword, signaling his archers to ready their bows, but his own hand trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, he told himself, but from the vibration of the air itself. Then the leading edge of the cloud passed over the vanguard of the army, and the truth was revealed in a horror of scale that the mind struggled to comprehend. It was not dust. It was not smoke. It was life. 1,000,000,000 times 1,000,000,000 tiny wings beating in unison, a living carpet that filled the sky from the ground to the clouds, a density of creatures so thick that they occupied every cubic inch of empty space. These were not the eagles of war or the lions of judgment, they were gnats. The smallest, most insignificant nuisance of the river banks, the weakest of all winged things, had been mustered in numbers that defied mathematics. They were not a swarm, they were an ocean of insects, a singular entity composed of countlessly trillions of individual hungers, all driven by the will of Al-Jabbaar, the compeller. The sheer absurdity of the weapon was the first blow. Nimrod had expected fire, he had expected lightning, he had expected a warrior worthy of his steel, and instead he was faced with a humiliation that stripped him of his martial dignity before a single blow was struck. How does one fight the wind? How does a spear stab the darkness? The soldiers stood paralyzed, their mouths agape, looking up into a vortex of swirling black specks that blocked out the sun so completely that noon became midnight in the span of a dozen heartbeats. The noise was now deafening, a screaming buzz that drowned out the shouts of the captains and the panicked neighing of the horses. It was a sound that spoke of an appetite that would not be denied, a hunger that had been held in check since the dawn of time and was now released with a specific target in mind. The darkness fell upon the army like a physical weight, a shroud of living noise that wrapped around the golden armor and the iron chariots, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment before the horror truly began, there was a stillness in the center of the storm, as if the swarm was pausing to look into the eyes of the man who thought he could kill God and judging him wanting. Nimrod stood in the unnatural night, surrounded by his hundreds of thousands of useless warriors, his golden armor dull in the shadow, his bloody arrow forgotten, and for the first time in 400 years the king of Babylon felt the icy grip of a terror that had no name. The compeller had not sent an equal to fight him, he had sent the lowliest of the low to demonstrate that even the smallest fragment of his creation was sufficient to bring the mightiest empire of man to its knees. The hum rose to a fever pitch, a shriek of 1,000,000,000 tiny voices, and the cloud descended. The descent of the swarm was not a collision of bodies but a suffocation of the soul, a moment where the physical laws of warfare were suspended and replaced by the biological imperative of consumption. When the black cloud finally made contact with the golden legions of Babylon, it did not strike like a hammer, but rather it enveloped them like a rising tide of brackish water, drowning the army in a living sea of wings and legs and insatiable hunger. The first reaction of the soldiers was the instinct of the drilled warrior, the raising of shields and the thrusting of spears, but one cannot stab a plague and one cannot shield against the very air one breathes. The gnats flowed around the edges of the bucklers and poured through the visors of the helmets, liquid in their movement and solid in their density. There was a horrific sound that rose up from the plain, a sound that was not the clamor of battle but the wet choking gurgle of 100,000 men trying to scream while their throats were filled with insects. The gnats did not merely bite, they sought entry. They crawled into the ears, driving men to instant madness with the scratching of tiny legs against the delicate drums of hearing. They swarmed into the nostrils, blocking the passage of air to the lungs, and they forced their way into the open, screaming mouths, pushing down the gullets in a thick writhing slurry. The horror was absolute and intimate. A soldier clad in the finest bronze armor, capable of turning aside the blow of a battle axe, found himself trapped within his own protection, his metal shell becoming a coffin as the swarm found the gaps at the joints, the spaces at the neck and the wrists, and flooded inside. They ate the eyes first. It was a strategic dismantling of the senses, a divine irony that those who had looked upon the world with the arrogance of their master were now blinded by the smallest of God's creatures. The plain of Shinar, which had been a parade ground of imperial might moments before, descended into a chaotic writhing mass of agony. Men dropped their weapons not out of surrender but because their hands were clawing at their own faces, tearing at their own flesh in a desperate, futile attempt to dig the invaders out of their skin. The horses, driven to a frenzy that shattered their hearts, trampled their riders into the dust, their large dark eyes vanishing beneath a carpet of crawling blackness. Their nostrils flared and clogged until they collapsed in heaving mounds of horseflesh that were consumed before they even ceased to twitch. The giants, the Nephilim, who had boasted that they could wrestle lions and pull down the pillars of temples, found that their strength was meaningless against an enemy that possessed no neck to wring and no bone to break. They swung their massive maces, crushing their own troops in their blindness, bellowing with a rage that quickly turned to a high, thin shriek of despair as the swarm entered them as easily as it entered the common foot soldier, devouring the demigods from the inside out. It was a feast of biblical proportions, a harvest of flesh where the reapers were the size of dust motes. And through it all Nimrod stood upon his chariot, his sword hanging limp in his hand, his golden armor untouched by the devastation that surrounded him. This too was a calculated cruelty of the compeller. The swarm moved around the king, leaving a circle of clear air about him, a calm eye in the hurricane of slaughter, so that he would be forced to witness the totality of his ruin. He watched as his generals, men who had been his companions in 100 victories, fell to their knees and were stripped of their humanity in seconds. He saw the flesh melt from their bones as if dissolved by acid, the gnats consuming muscle and sinew with a speed that defied nature, leaving only clean white skeletons collapsing inside the hollow clatter of falling armor. It was a dismantling of power so thorough that it bordered on the magical. The army did not retreat because there was no one left to retreat. The army did not surrender because there was no one left to accept terms. The army simply ceased to exist as a biological entity and became a geological layer of bone and iron. The noise of the screaming faded, replaced once again by the singular deafening drone of the wings, a sound that seemed to mock the silence of the dead. The smell of the battlefield was not the metallic scent of blood but the dry, dusty smell of old parchment and the musk of the insects, a scent that would haunt the nightmares of the survivors for generations. Nimrod looked out over the sea of devastation, his mind struggling to process the visual data. He had brought the might of the world to fight a war, and the world had been eaten. There were no bodies to bury, only heaps of armor filled with picked clean bones standing in silent testimony to the folly of challenging the divine. The banners of Babylon embroidered with gold and purple lay tattered in the dust, trampled not by enemy boots but by the dying throes of the very men who carried them. The pride of the tyrant, the foundation upon which he had built his tower, was stripped away layer by layer until he stood naked in his golden shell, a king of nothing, a ruler of graveyards. And then the fear truly took him. It was not the fear of death, for death would have been a release from the shame, but the fear of the one who controlled this horror. He realized with a jolt that nearly stopped his heart that the arrow he had fired, the blood he had seen, was all a prelude to this moment of absolute subjugation. The compeller was forcing him to watch, forcing him to understand that his power was a loan that had been called in. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the haze of his shock. He turned his chariot, the wheels grinding over the debris of his fallen legions, and whipped his horses, which by some dark miracle had been spared the fate of the others, toward the city gates. The king of the world fled. He did not ride with the dignity of a monarch but with the frantic desperation of a thief caught in the act. He abandoned his people, he abandoned his tower, and he abandoned the illusion of his divinity, leaving behind the silence of the bone field to hide behind the thick walls of his palace. But as he fled, the swarm did not pursue the main host. The cloud of gnats lifted from the skeletons, rising back into the air like a reverse rain hanging suspended in the sky, a dark judgment that had finished its work. Save for one. One single gnat separated itself from the billions. It was not the largest nor the strongest, but a lamed creature with a torn wing, a speck of imperfection in the mass. It did not return to the heavens with its kin. It caught the scent of the fierce sweat that trailed behind the fleeing chariot, and it began to follow. It buzzed a low solitary note, a counterpoint to the thundering hooves of the king's retreat. Nimrod rode through the empty streets of Babylon, where the citizens had barred their doors and hidden in cellars, their faith in their protector shattered by the sounds they had heard from the plain. He reached the palace, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes darting to the shadows, expecting the swarm to pour over the walls at any moment. He burst into the throne room, shouting for his guards, for his attendants, for anyone to seal the doors, to bar the windows, to bring fire and water. He was a man unraveling a thread pulled loose from the fabric of reality. He stripped off his armor, letting the heavy golden plates crash to the floor, oblivious to the value of what he discarded. He was alive, he told himself. He had survived. The army was gone, but he was still Nimrod, he was still the king. He paced the floor of the great hall, his mind racing with plans to rebuild, to punish, to hide. He did not hear the soft hum that had followed him through the city gates, through the palace corridors, and into the very heart of his sanctuary. He did not see the tiny speck that hovered in the air behind him, waiting for the moment when the king would stop moving, waiting for the breath to slow. The destruction of the army was merely the opening act, the breaking of the shield. Now the compeller would turn his attention to the man himself. Nimrod sank onto his throne, exhausted, his head in his hands, trying to banish the image of the white bones and the black cloud. He took a deep breath, inhaling the cool air of the palace, trying to steady his shaking hands. And in that inhalation, in that sharp intake of breath, he sealed his doom. The lame gnat, caught in the draft of the king's own respiration, flew upward. It did not strike the skin, it did not bite the flesh. It rode the air current into the dark cavern of the royal nostril. Nimrod sneezed a violent convulsive sound and rubbed his nose, thinking it merely dust or a stray hair. But the irritation did not cease. It moved. He felt a crawling sensation, a tiny scratching pressure pushing upward past the sinus cavity, navigating the labyrinth of bone and cartilage with a terrifying purpose. The king clawed at his face, his fingers digging into his nose, trying to dislodge the intruder, but it was too deep. It burrowed further, pushing against the sensitive membranes, driving towards the darkness of the cranial cavity. And then it stopped. For a second there was silence. Nimrod sat frozen, his eyes wide with a horror that transcended the physical. And then inside the echo chamber of his own skull the buzzing began. The silence of the palace was alive, for while the halls were hushed and the courtiers walked on tiptoes for fear of waking a dragon, the inside of the king's head had become a cathedral of noise, a screaming acoustic chamber where a single uninvited guest performed a liturgy of torture that defied the laws of biology. The gnat, having navigated the sinus passages like a thief slipping through the ventilation shafts of a treasury, had lodged itself against the dura mater, that sensitive membrane that sheathes the brain, and there it began its work. It was not merely a sound, it was a vibration that traveled down the spine and rattled the teeth in their sockets, a high-pitched incessant drone that sounded like a saw cutting through wet bone. Nimrod, the hunter of men, the builder of towers, the man who had looked God in the eye and laughed, now found himself clawing at his own face with fingernails that had become jagged and bloody. He summoned the physicians, first the men of science and magic who claimed to know the secrets of the body and the stars. They came with their silver needles and their hooks, with their potions of opium and mandrake and their bowls of steaming vinegar meant to draw out the impurity. They peered up the royal nostril with magnifying lenses of polished crystal, but they saw nothing but the inflamed red flesh of a man who had been rubbing his nose until it was raw. They poured oil into his ears, thinking to drown the creature, but the gnat was safe in the air pocket of the skull, dry and comfortable, and it buzzed louder in protest at the intrusion. The king screamed. It was not a scream of command or anger but a high thin wail of animal distress that shattered the image of his divinity forever in the eyes of those who heard it. He ordered the physicians to cut him, to slice open his nose, to drill into his forehead if they had to, but when the chief surgeon approached with a trembling hand holding a flint scalpel, the king in a fit of agony struck the man dead with a single blow of his fist. The pain was absolute. It was a pressure that built behind the eyes, pushing them outward until they bulged like the eyes of a strangled man. It was an itch that could not be scratched, a sensation of movement deep within the grey matter, as if the insect were walking upon the very surface of his thoughts, tracking its dirty legs across his memories and his ambitions. Sleep became a memory, a distant country from which he had been exiled. For how can a man sleep when a drill is operating inside his head? One day bled into the next, and the night was indistinguishable from the noon save for the color of the shadows on the wall. The mighty Nimrod, who had ruled for 400 years without a day of sickness, began to wither. His skin turned grey and pasty, his eyes became rimmed with red sores, and his body, once a temple of muscle and power, began to shake with the tremors of the exhausted. He paced the floors of his chamber until he wore a groove in the stone, walking miles in circles trying to outrun the sound, trying to exhaust the creature, but the gnat was sustained by a power that was not its own. It did not need to eat, it did not need to rest, it only needed to exist. The madness took root in the second week. The king began to talk to the voice in his head, begging it to stop, bargaining with it, offering it gold, offering it blood, offering it the throne itself if it would only grant him one moment of silence. But the gnat was not a merchant, it was an executioner, and executioners do not negotiate. It was in a moment of pure unadulterated rage that the king discovered the only remedy, the only medicine that the compeller had allowed him. He had been standing by the heavy stone wall of his chamber, his head feeling as though it were filled with boiling lead, and in a spasm of frustration he slammed his forehead against the granite blocks with a sickening thud. The impact was brutal enough to split the skin and send a trickle of blood down into his eyes, but in the instant following the blow there was a miracle. The buzzing stopped. The gnat, shocked by the concussion, the sudden violent displacement of its world, had paused. For 10 glorious blissful seconds there was silence. Nimrod slid down the wall weeping with relief, the pain of the bruise on his forehead nothing compared to the cessation of the torture. He breathed. He closed his eyes. He thought that perhaps he had killed it, that the nightmare was over. But as his heart rate slowed, as the adrenaline of the impact faded, the gnat shook itself off and began to clean its wings. And then slowly, tentatively at first, and then with renewed vigor, the buzzing returned. It started low, a menacing hum, and rose quickly to the familiar shrieking crescendo. The king howled and smashed his head against the wall again, harder this time. Thud. Silence. 15 seconds of peace. Then the buzz. Thud. Silence. The buzz. It was a mechanism of behavior modification, a training regime designed for a dog but applied to a god king. He learned quickly that the harder the blow, the longer the silence. A slap with the hand bought him a breath. A punch to the temple bought him a minute. A collision with the wall bought him a brief respite of clarity. And so the routine of the palace changed. The harps were silenced, the flutes were broken, and the new music of the court became the rhythmic wet sound of violence. But a man cannot beat his own head forever. His arms grew tired, his strength failed, and the angle was awkward. He needed help. He summoned his guards, his most loyal Praetorians, men who had sworn to die for him, and he gave them an order that froze the blood in their veins. He commanded them to strike him. At first they refused, for to strike the king was death, a blasphemy that carried the penalty of being flayed alive. They stood trembling, their weapons lowered, looking at the wreck of a man who knelt before them, his forehead a mask of purple bruises and open cuts. "Strike me!" Nimrod screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Strike me, or I will have your heads." One guard, a captain named Cush, hesitated, and then with a look of terrified apology raised his heavy gloved hand and slapped the king across the face. Nimrod sighed a long shuddering exhale of relief as the buzzing ceased for a moment. But it was not enough. "Harder," he commanded. "Use your sandal. Use your hilt." And so began the ritual that would define the rest of his wretched life. The king of the world, the tyrant who had enslaved the nations, sat on the floor of his golden chamber while his own slaves took turns beating him. They used leather straps, they used wooden mallets, they used the soles of their boots. They formed shifts, a roster of tormentors working in rotations to ensure that the king was never without a beating, for the moment the blows stopped the buzzing returned with a vengeance. Imagine the scene, the sheer grotesque absurdity of it. The man who claimed to be the peer of God sitting in a puddle of his own drool and blood, pointing to his head and begging a servant to hit him with a block of wood. The blows had to be precise enough to shock the insect but not hard enough to kill the host immediately, for death was too easy an escape. The compeller is the one who forces the will, and here he had forced the tyrant to crave his own abuse. The skull of Nimrod began to change shape over the years. The bone thickened in response to the constant trauma, developing ridges and calluses, a deformed helmet of calcium that made him look less like a man and more like a monster. His brain was rattled daily, shaken like a walnut in a shell, and his intellect, that sharp cunning mind that had devised the tower and the empire, began to fragment. He forgot the names of his wives. He forgot the layout of his city. He forgot the language of the stars. The only thing he remembered, the only thing that remained clear in the fog of his dementia, was the buzzing and the need for the blow. 400 years he had reigned in splendor, a golden age of tyranny where his word was law. But the punishment was tailored to the crime. For every decade of arrogance he spent a year in this hell. 40 years. 4 decades of being battered. The young soldiers who had struck him in the beginning grew old and retired, their wrists weak from years of hammering the royal skull, and their sons took their places, inheriting the strangest duty in the history of the empire. The people of Babylon whispered. They said that the king was fighting a demon. They said that he was doing penance. They did not know the truth that a simple gnat, a creature with a lifespan of days, had been supernaturally sustained by the will of Al-Jabbaar to serve as a jailer for a soul that could not be contained by stone bars. The palace became a place of horror, a haunted house where the screams of the king and the thud of the mallets echoed through the corridors day and night. Diplomats from foreign lands would arrive to pay tribute and would be turned away at the gates, their gifts unaccepted, because the king was busy. Busy being beaten. Busy buying silence with concussions. The irony was as heavy as the hammers. Nimrod had wanted to be struck by God, he had wanted the attention of the heavens, he had built a tower to demand it. And now he had it. He was the center of the universe for this one tiny insect. He was the sole focus of a divine wrath that did not burn him with fire but eroded him with sound and humiliation. As the years dragged on, the king's resistance faded. He no longer screamed. He no longer commanded. He simply sat, a broken heap of meat and bone, rocking back and forth, waiting for the next blow, receiving it with a whimper of gratitude. The buzzing was the only reality. The world outside, the sun, the river, the tower, it all ceased to matter. There was only the gnat and the hammer. The dichotomy of his existence was complete. He was the master of the world and the slave of a bug. And as the 40th year approached, the year that would mark the end of his sentence and the end of his life, the gnat, which had grown old with him, which had become a part of his very physiology, began to sense that the finale was near. The buzzing changed pitch one last time, not a sound of torture but a sound of summoning. The body of the king was failing, his heart worn out by the stress of 4 decades of panic, his brain turned to mush by a million impacts. He was a ruin, a testament to the fact that pride is not merely a sin but a madness. The final day dawned not with the sun but with a silence that was different from the others. The guards stood ready, their mallets raised, their faces grim masks of duty, but the king did not signal them. He looked up, his eyes milky and blind, seeing something that was not in the room. He lifted a hand, a trembling claw, and touched the ruin of his forehead. The gnat had stopped. But this time it was not because it was shocked. It was because it was finished. The silence was louder than the buzzing had ever been. It was the silence of the grave opening. Nimrod opened his mouth to speak, to utter one last curse or perhaps one last prayer, but only a dry rattle emerged. The compeller had broken the breaker. The repairer had dismantled the destroyer. And in the stillness of that torture chamber the king realized with a final flicker of dying consciousness that the hammer was about to fall one last time, not from the hand of a servant but from the hand of the inevitable. The sun rose on the final day of the tyrant's life with a color that resembled the bruising on a dead man's skin, a sickly purple light that filtered through the heavy curtains of the royal chamber and illuminated the wreckage of a human being. It was the end of the 40th year of the torment, a biblical span of time that had transformed the most powerful monarch in history into a twisted, gnarled root of suffering. Nimrod sat in the center of the room on a pile of cushions that had long since lost their embroidery to the filth of his neglect, his head hanging low like a fruit too heavy for the branch. The atmosphere in the room was thick enough to choke on, smelling of stale sweat, dried blood, and the cloying metallic scent of fear that had radiated from the king's pores for 4 decades. The silence that had fallen at the end of the previous chapter was not the peace of resolution but the gathering of breath before a scream. The gnat deep within the labyrinth of the royal skull had ceased its buzzing, not to rest but to reposition. It had spent 40 years as a tenant in the house of the king's mind, eroding his sanity, scratching at his memories and drinking the electrical impulses of his thoughts, but now the creature sensed that the host was crumbling. The architecture of the bone was failing. The ridges of calcium that had built up from thousands upon thousands of blows were brittle, and the brain beneath them was a swamp of trauma. The gnat moved. It did not fly, for there was no room to spread its wings in the tight confines of the cranial cavity. Instead it crawled. It dragged its serrated legs across the sensitive surface of the dura mater, digging its way toward the very stem of the brain, the primal stalk that controlled the breath and the heart. Nimrod gasped, his eyes flying open wide and unseeing, the whites completely obscured by a web of burst capillaries. The pain was no longer a sound. It was a physical invasion, a sensation of sharp hot needles being driven slowly into the base of his neck. He tried to stand, but his legs, which had carried him across the world in his youth, betrayed him, and he collapsed into a heap of trembling limbs. The guards stationed at the door, men who had been born after the buzzing began and knew their king only as a mad beast to be managed, watched with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They gripped the handles of their wooden mallets, their knuckles white, for they knew the routine, but this morning felt different. The rhythm was broken. The king did not point to his forehead. He did not beg for the strike. He was clawing at his throat, his mouth opening and closing in a silent fish-like panting, as if he were trying to vomit up his own soul. The gnat had reached the precipice of the brain stem, and there it bit down. It was a microscopic bite, a nip that would not have been felt on the calloused skin of a hand, but inside the skull, directly on the nerve center of life, it was a lightning bolt. Nimrod let out a sound that had never been heard from a human throat before, a guttural, wet, tearing noise that rose in pitch until it cracked the very air of the chamber. It was the sound of a mind snapping. He rolled onto his back, his heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the stone floor, his hands tearing at his ears, trying to rip them from his head to let the pressure out. The pressure was building. The compeller was squeezing. The skull, which had been his fortress, was now a vice. Nimrod rolled his eyes toward the captain of the guard, a man named Elam, whose father had struck the king in the early years and who had inherited this cursed duty like a family heirloom. The king's eyes were pleading, but not for mercy. They were pleading for annihilation. He pointed a shaking finger not at his temple but at the very center of his forehead, at the thickest part of the deformed bone plate that had grown over the decades. He did not speak, for he could not speak, but his intention was screamed into the silence. He wanted the end. He wanted the wall to come down. Elam hesitated. To strike the king was a duty, but to kill the king was a crime that carried a sentence of eternal damnation in the eyes of the court. Yet the agony on the face of the man on the floor was so absolute, so total, that it transcended the laws of men. It was a suffering that demanded a solution. The gnat bit again, harder, deeper, grinding its mandibles into the soft white tissue. Nimrod arched his back, his spine bending like a bow, his jaw locking open in a rictus of agony. He slammed his hand against the floor once, twice, 3 times. The command was clear. Finish it. Elam looked at the other guards and saw the same terror reflected in their eyes. They were witnessing the implosion of a god. The captain stepped forward, raising the heavy mallet of ironwood, a tool that had been polished smooth by years of violence. He did not aim for a glancing blow. He did not aim to stun. He raised the weapon high above his head, his muscles bunching, and with a cry that was half prayer and half curse he brought it down with all the strength of his youth. The sound of the impact was wet and heavy like a melon being dropped from a great height. The deformed bone of the forehead, compromised by 40 years of fractures, finally gave way. It did not merely crack, it shattered, caving inward under the force of the ironwood, driving fragments of the skull deep into the grey matter that had once dreamed of conquering heaven. Nimrod's body went rigid for a single second, a final spasm of electrical discharge, and then it went limp. The king of Babylon, the mighty hunter, the builder of the tower, fell back against the cushions, a lifeless sack of meat. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The buzzing had stopped. The screaming had stopped. The heavy breathing of the guards was the only sound in the room. Dust motes danced in the shaft of purple light that fell across the face of the corpse. And then came the final horror, the final punctuation mark on the sentence of Al-Jabbaar. As the guards watched, paralyzed by the enormity of what they had done, they saw movement on the king's face. From the ruin of the shattered forehead, from the bloody crater where the bone had caved in, something emerged. It was not a soul ascending to glory. It was not a demon bursting forth in fire. It was a gnat. A single small, seemingly fragile insect crawled out of the wound. It was wet with the blood of the tyrant, and it moved with the sluggish lethargy of an old creature. It shook its wings, cleaning the royal blood from its frame with a casual indifference that was more insulting than any spit. It did not fly away immediately. It crawled across the bridge of the nose that had been held so high in arrogance, it walked across the eyelid that had looked upon the world with disdain, and it stood for a moment on the king's lip. The contrast was the ultimate sermon. The largest man in the world lay dead, killed by the command of the smallest soldier. The guards backed away, terrified not of the corpse but of the insect. They realized then that they were not in the presence of a tragedy but in the presence of a correction. The gnat, having finished its ablutions, buzzed its wings once, a short dry sound, and lifted into the air. It circled the body once and then flew out of the open window, disappearing into the vast blue sky, returning to the dust from which it came, its mission complete. The news of the king's death spread through Babylon not like a wildfire but like a slow creeping chill. There was no mourning. There was no tearing of clothes. There was only a collective exhale, a release of the tension that had held the city captive for a generation. The people looked at the unfinished tower that loomed over them, the brick mountain that had consumed the lives of their fathers, and suddenly it did not look like a stairway to heaven. It looked like a tombstone. It looked like a fool's cap set upon the head of the earth. Without the will of the tyrant to drive them, the slaves dropped their tools. The mortar dried in the buckets. The bricks were left unlaid. The ziggurat was abandoned, not because of a confusion of languages in that moment, but because the fear of the man who built it had been replaced by the fear of the one who broke him. The body of Nimrod was not given a state funeral. It was wrapped in simple linen and buried in a grave that was unmarked, for who would want to remember the location of such shame? The empire crumbled as empires do when they are built on the ego of a single man. The satraps declared independence, the generals fought amongst themselves, and the golden age of Babylon dissolved into the grey twilight of history. But the lesson remained branded into the consciousness of the region. The name Al-Jabbaar was whispered in the tents of the nomads and the temples of the faithful. It is a name that is often mistranslated as merely the tyrant or the oppressor, but the story of Nimrod reveals its true frightening depth. Al-Jabbaar is the one who compels. He is the one who forces the broken bone back into place even if the setting of the bone causes agony. He is the repairer who fixes the universe by breaking the things that are crooked. Nimrod was a crooked thing, a bone that had grown out of place, jutting against the order of creation, claiming to be the head when he was merely a foot. And so Al-Jabbaar used the smallest clamp available to force him back into alignment. He broke the king to repair the world. The tower stood for centuries, slowly eroding under the wind and the rain, its sharp edges rounded by time, becoming a shapeless mound of mud. Travelers would pass by it and ask what it was, and the locals would tell them the story of the gnat and the king. They would tell them that greatness is not measured by the height of your walls but by the humility of your heart. They would tell them that if you raise your head too high in arrogance, the universe has a way of lowering it for you. The wind that blows through the ruins of Babylon today still carries a sound if you listen closely. It is not the sound of chariots or the shouting of armies. It is a low persistent buzzing, the sound of the smallest soldier reminding the dust that it is only dust. The story of Nimrod is not a tragedy, for tragedies require a hero. It is a warning. It is a terrifying, vibrant reminder that there is no fortress thick enough to keep out the will of God, and there is no crown heavy enough to protect a head that has forgotten to bow. The insect flew away, but the fear remains. And somewhere in the vast unseen army of the compeller there is always another gnat waiting for another nose.